I've been sitting here for 3 days trying to figure out how to even start this. Maybe it's the silence. Clara's been sleeping in Jake's room since our fight, and the house feels like it's holding its breath. I guess I'll just say it. My wife gave our son his birthday present without me, and now I'm wondering if my marriage is a slow-motion car crash. It all started with the bike. Jake turned 5 last week, and Clara and I had agreed to get him his first big kid bike. We'd talked about it for months, how we'd take him to the park and teach him to ride without training wheels, the whole thing. But my job has kept me late most nights. I work in IT for a healthcare company, which sounds bland until you realize hospitals don't close, and neither do their tech issues. Clara was the one who convinced me to take the position 2 years ago. It paid 30% more than my old job, and she wanted us to move closer to her parents, explaining that Jake needed family around. So now I commute 90 minutes each way. I hadn't even known she'd bought the bike until I got home last Tuesday. Jake came sprinting down the driveway, bursting with excitement about the gift his mom had gotten him. The bike was bright blue with a ribbon tied to the handlebars and a little card that simply read, "Love, Mom and Dad." Clara stood on the porch with her arms crossed. I asked why she hadn't waited, given that his birthday was still 3 days away, and she just shrugged while explaining that he was too excited and I wouldn't have made it home in time anyway. That stung. I've missed dinners, school plays, bedtime stories. I know that. I always thought we were a team. When I mentioned that it felt like I was becoming just the weekend dad, she snapped back that I was never here and that I was making him think I didn't care. I didn't know how to respond. Later, while tucking Jake in, he asked if I didn't like his bike, recalling that Clara had told him I was too busy to help pick it out. I didn't know what to say. How do you explain to a 5-year-old that your job is the reason you're missing his life? The next morning, when I checked our joint account, I discovered that the bike cost $400, even though we had agreed months ago to cap birthday gifts at $200 since money had been tight after the move. When I mentioned this, Clara rolled her eyes and remarked that I was really nickel and diming our son's happiness. She's always been more eloquent with her words than I am. Things have been off between us ever since I took the job. She wanted the house, the yard, the stability, but now it feels like I'm a ghost haunting her carefully curated life. When I tried apologizing for the fight and promised to work on being home more, she just stared at me and accused me of always playing the victim. The worst part was Jake's drawing. He brought it home from preschool the day after we got the bike, a crayon family portrait showing Clara and him holding hands with smiles like sunshine, while I was depicted as a tiny, faceless stick figure in the corner. I had pinned it to the fridge, but Clara took it down. My sister thinks that Clara has resented me for years. According to her, Clara wanted the house, the salary, and even the perfect family photo, yet she wasn't willing to pay the real cost. I didn't understand what she meant until I found a receipt in Clara's gym bag for a $250 deposit on a family photo shoot scheduled for next weekend. When I confronted her about it, she didn't even flinch and explained that she had booked it as a way to compensate, since I was never around, and she refused to cancel. I ended up taking a half day at work to surprise Jake at school pickup, only to find him in tears. His teacher pulled me aside and mentioned that Jake believed I was there because he had been misbehaving. Clara's routine with him is almost military precise. Park Mondays, library Thursdays with no deviations, and I had disrupted that order. When I asked what was wrong, she accused me of being selfish and said that I didn't get to swoop in and play hero just because it was convenient. Last night, I overheard Clara on the phone with her mom. In a low voice that barely filled the room, she said she was done making excuses for him and that Jake deserved better. I can't tell if she meant better than me or better than the situation we're in. I'm not blameless. I took the job, I signed the mortgage, and I thought we were building something together. Now I'm staring at Jake's stick figure version of me, wondering if that's all I really am, a shadow they've already outgrown. It's been 3 days of silence, 3 days of Clara brushing past me like I'm just a piece of furniture. I don't know how to fix this, and I don't even know if she wants to. All I know is that yesterday, Jake asked if I was going away forever, and I didn't have an answer for that either. Maybe I'm the asshole, maybe I'm just tired, but I can't shake the feeling that Clara has been erasing me from our family, one missed birthday at a time. So how do you stop being a ghost in your own life? Now for the first update. It's been 2 weeks since I posted here, and honestly, things aren't better, they're worse. I've been trying, like really trying, to fix this, but every time I reach for something solid, it slips through my fingers. I started leaving work earlier to spend time with Jake. Not early enough to beat traffic, but enough to maybe catch the tail end of his afternoon. The first day I got home at 4:30 in the afternoon with my heart racing as if I had just won some kind of race, and Clara was busy buckling Jake into his car seat. She mentioned they were going to the zoo because he had been begging to see the penguins. I asked if I could come along, but she simply clicked his seatbelt shut and remarked that I was already late. The next day was a play date with a kid from his preschool, and the day after that, she had a mommy and me pottery class she'd signed up for weeks ago. By Friday, when I showed up at 3:45, the house was empty, and there was a note left behind saying that Jake had been taken to the park and would be back by bedtime. I only realized how systematic things had become when I checked our shared calendar and discovered that every afternoon was blocked off with a new activity: library story hour, a splash pad, and even a nature walk in her parents' backyard. All of these had been added in the last week and occupied the exact window I had carved out for him. Then there was the issue of money. We always split expenses, using a joint account for bills and personal accounts for everything else. But when I noticed that our grocery spending had dropped to almost nothing, I grew suspicious. I logged into the joint account and saw that she hadn't used it for anything in 12 days. Not for groceries, not for Jake's swim lessons, not even for gas. I asked her about it casually while she was chopping vegetables, and she explained that she had simply been using her own card because it was easier to track. Still, I couldn't shake the suspicion that it might have been easier to hide. I suggested that we sit down to review the budget together, but her expression went blank as she questioned whether I was trying to criticize the way she was raising our son. She refused to consider my suggestion, even when I reminded her that we had agreed to be transparent after the bike incident. She simply said that I would only use the information against her, and that was all. Last week, Jake's teacher called and said that he had been unusually clingy at drop-off, hiding behind Clara and refusing to let go. The teacher gently suggested that sometimes when there is instability at home, kids tend to regress a little. I wanted to argue that our home wasn't unstable but simply strained. Yet I recalled the night before when I had walked in on Clara and Jake building a pillow fort in the living room. Jake had shouted excitedly when he saw me and ran toward me, only for Clara to grab his arm and insist that he finish building the fort before I got involved. The issue about the lawyer came as a complete surprise. I was looking for a stapler in her desk drawer when I discovered a pamphlet tucked away under a stack of old birthday cards. It was an advertisement for family law and custody services with a sticky note instructing me to call regarding primary custody options. My hands went cold. I confronted her that night, holding the pamphlet as if it were undeniable evidence, and she didn't deny it. Instead, she admitted calmly that she was exploring other options and mentioned that I had been unpredictable lately. Unpredictable indeed, apparently because I had asked to review the budget and arrived home before sunset. Work was also adding to the pressure. My boss pulled me aside last Thursday about missed deadlines and a server outage that I had overslept for, remarking that I used to be the rock of the team. I ended up canceling the vacation day I had set aside for Jake's soccer game, thinking that if I showed more commitment at work, I might eventually earn some leeway. Meanwhile, Clara took Jake on her own and posted a picture in the family group chat of him mid-kick and grinning, with glowing comments from her parents about how amazing she was and how lucky Jake was to have her. I stared at the screen until my eyes burned. Then there was the missing $3,000. Our emergency fund had been at $8,000 for months, but when I checked it on a whim, I found that it had dropped to $5,000. When I asked Clara about it, she quickly explained that there had been a plumbing leak and a pipe in the basement had burst while I was at work. However, the basement was completely dry. I had checked every corner and even taken a photo of the spotless floor. I sent her the photo with a simple question, and she replied that it must have been a mistake and that she would look into it. The next morning, I called a lawyer, not the one she had been using, but someone new. The first thing he asked was whether my wife had retained counsel. After running a check, I discovered that she had been consulting with him for months, dating back to before the bike incident, before the photo shoot, and possibly even before I noticed the growing distance between us. We tried therapy, just one session. During that session, when the therapist asked about our communication, I brought up the money issues, the bike, the missing $3,000, and the secret account. In response, Clara abruptly got up, causing her chair to screech, and declared that she wasn't willing to continue, leaving the session suddenly. That night, Jake started wetting the bed, and the pediatrician later explained that stress could trigger such behavior. All I could think was that my 5-year-old was stressed simply because his mom wouldn't even stay in the same room with me for 45 minutes. Her mom called yesterday, insisting in a rehearsed tone that I was hurting Jake and that I needed to let go. I almost laughed at the absurdity of the suggestion. Let go of what, my son? My marriage? The life we had built because Clara had her own plans for the house, the job, and everything else? This morning, I found a note in her handwriting tucked into her nightstand. It outlined a plan for primary custody and a relocation to her parents' town, with no mention of me at all. It was just a checklist that included filing in a certain county, arranging a school transfer, and updating the pediatrician. After dinner, I pleaded with her, my voice cracking, begging her not to take him away from me. She looked at me calmly and said that she would consider it if I signed over the house. Now I'm in the guest room, with Jake's drawing taped to the wall, the one where I appear as just a tiny stick figure in the corner. Clara may not be much of an artist, but she has redrawn our family into real life, leaving me to wonder if there's still a place for me in the picture. 2 weeks. 2 weeks of desperately trying to claw my way back into my own life, and all I have is a lawyer's number on speed dial and a son who is too afraid to fall asleep. I am uncertain whether I am losing my mind or simply losing everything, but I do know that I cannot allow him to grow up thinking of me as nothing more than a shadow in the corner, not without a fight. Now for the second update. It's been a month since I first posted, and I don't even recognize my life anymore. Every time I think I've got a grip, something else shatters. I hired a lawyer, something I never imagined doing against my own wife, and within days he uncovered a $15,000 transfer from our joint account to her parents, listed simply as a loan with no discussion or warning. When I confronted Clara about it, she didn't even react. She explained that the money was meant to create a safer environment for Jake. It was ironic, because the very home she chose for its closeness to her parents was suddenly considered unsafe. When I asked her how I fit into that situation, she simply gave me a look that made me feel as if I were overreacting. I kept asking her to give counseling another try. At first she agreed, but then she canceled just an hour before the session, claiming that Jake had a fever. The next time around, her car wouldn't start when we were headed out, and even though I offered to pick her up, I was met with silence. Then came Jake's birthday party. Clara had been planning it for weeks, and when I brought up the idea of inviting my sister and nephews, she dismissed it, insisting that their presence would stress him out. It was strange, given that just 2 months earlier he had been laughing with them at the park. I decided not to press the matter, believing that showing up was more important than the guest list. But when I arrived at the party, I noticed that as soon as I entered, Jake's laughter abruptly stopped. Clara had arranged a photo booth with a banner proclaiming a forever bond between her and Jake, leaving no space for me, not even a glimpse in the background. What shattered me next was finding a message on Clara's iPad. Left open on the kitchen counter, it was a message to her sister that made it clear that once she had full custody, I would never see Jake again. My hands trembled so badly that I almost dropped the device. After that, I began secretly recording our conversations, keeping my phone tucked away as if on a covert mission. One night, I directly questioned her about the $15,000 transfer while she was unaware of the recording. To her, it was obvious that the money was intended for a down payment on a house near her parents, and in her view, Jake needed stability, a quality I apparently did not provide. Following my lawyer's warning that if Clara relocated, I might lose him for good, I moved quickly to file for custody. In retaliation, Clara told Jake that I was trying to take him away from his mother. Soon after, Jake started hiding behind doors whenever I stepped into a room, even whispering for me to go away. The first time I heard those words, I sat in my car and cried so hard I couldn't breathe. The court granted us temporary shared custody, but Clara routinely disrupted our arrangements. She forgot pickups, scheduled dentist appointments during my designated time, and even once took him to a puppet show an hour away, leaving me waiting at an empty driveway 3 times in a row. Later on, I discovered that she had been coaching Jake. One night, I overheard her in his room, speaking in a strangely soothing voice as she instructed him what to say if I asked about her new house and what to do if I got upset. I stood there gripping the doorframe, wondering when we had become complete strangers to one another. A coworker later mentioned that she had seen Clara having lunch with a man in a suit who turned out to be her lawyer. They were laughing over salads, and I couldn't help but wonder if their amusement was somehow directed at me. Around the same time, Jake's drawings grew darker. He used to sketch our family with me as a simple stick figure, but now I appeared as a monstrous figure with scribbled claws looming over a tearful Clara. When I asked him about his new drawings, he explained that his mother had told him I was always angry. I was at a loss for words, struggling with how to explain to a 5-year-old that his mother wasn't being truthful, even though the drawing made me look like the very monster she was accusing me of being. Eventually, I confronted Clara about everything: the growing parental alienation, the coaching, and the mysterious $15,000. Instead of taking responsibility, she implied that I needed to prove my claims, Determined, I gathered evidence and had my lawyer subpoena her therapist's notes. It turned out that she had admitted to using Jake as a tool to end our marriage. Following this revelation, the court ordered a psychological evaluation for Jake. When the examiner asked why he was scared of me, he repeated that I was rarely around and that his mother claimed I was mean. Although the judge criticized Clara for her manipulative behavior, I was still granted only supervised visitation, as if I were the one posing a threat. Now, I see Jake in a sterile room twice a week while a stranger watches us interact over a simple game of Candyland. One time, he wouldn't even allow me to shuffle the cards. In the end, it seems that Clara has the upper hand. She has managed to win over the system, shape the narrative, and even collected those heartwarming photos of her and Jake embracing in front of her parents' perfect porch. But I'm not giving up. Every time I see him recoil when I try to hold his hand, I remember the little boy who once ran straight into my arms when I got home. That spirit is still there, and I will continue fighting until he knows that I never stopped fighting for him. 2 households, 2 parents, and 1 little boy stuck in the middle. I don't know how this will all end, but I refuse to let her erase my role in his life, at least not without a fight. Now for the final update. It had been 6 months since my last update, and I was still trying to process how we got here. The court finally granted me 50-50 custody after months of sifting through financial records and therapy notes to prove Clara's manipulation. Yet winning felt less like victory and more like surviving a landslide. Around that time, Jake began play therapy, and I clearly remember the moment he looked at me and claimed that his mommy didn't love them. I had to excuse myself to the bathroom just to hold it together in front of him. How can you explain to a 5-year-old that the person they trust most is lying to them? You can't. You just keep showing up. Not long after the custody ruling, Clara's lawyer dropped her year. Apparently, she had missed payments, likely because the court forced her to return the $15,000 she had funneled to her parents. The down payment on what was meant to be a safer house fell through, and she ended up moving back in with them. I rented an apartment about 10 minutes from Jake's school and furnished it with secondhand items and an absurd number of Lego sets. The first weekend he stayed over, we built a spaceship together. He didn't say much, but when he rested his head on my shoulder, I felt as though I had finally done something right. Then there was the drawing. One night, after tucking him in, he handed me a crayon sketch depicting 2 houses, one marked as Mommy's and the other as Daddy's, with him standing in the middle holding both our hands. I pinned it to the fridge next to the grocery list, and I could almost tell that Clara would have hated how off-center it was. A week later, Clara arrived at my apartment unannounced, her hair frizzy from the rain, demanding that I forgive her for Jake's sake. I had rehearsed that moment 100 times, expecting anger and accusations, but all I felt was exhaustion. I suggested co-parenting counseling instead, but she brushed it off as a waste of time, even though the court mandated the sessions anyway. We ended up sitting in an overly bright office as a therapist urged us to speak directly to one another, rather than through Jake. Throughout the session, Clara kept twisting her wedding ring, the same one she had stopped wearing months earlier. Around that time, the bedwetting finally stopped, a small mercy in a tumultuous period. One morning, as I was halfway through a pancake, Jake asked if we could all have pizza together like we used to. I told him that maybe someday, though my chest ached with the weight of loss. It's hard to mourn a family that is still alive. Then came the custody hearing, and Clara's new boyfriend showed up uninvited. Wearing a Patagonia vest, he nodded along as she insisted that her home was stable. The judge seemed to notice his presence, glanced between him and Clara's evasive responses regarding their relationship timeline, and raised an eyebrow. 2 days later, primary custody was awarded to me while Clara was granted weekends. Selling the house turned out to be easier than I expected. We split the proceeds evenly, although I later heard that her parents had stopped speaking to her after the trial. Karma felt like a quiet ghost. It didn't overturn anything violently, but silently stood by as you tripped over your own mess. One of the best moments came in a whisper. One night, as I was tucking Jake into bed, he grabbed my sleeve and made it known that he was glad I had fought for him. I didn't know how to respond, so I just hugged him tightly, hoping he could feel every unspoken apology and every bit of love I held inside. Last month in therapy, Clara apologized, not the kind performed for show, but the kind delivered with a shaky voice and reddened cheeks. She admitted that the resentment she felt over my long commute, the very one she had insisted upon for the house she wanted, had warped into something beyond her control. I didn't fully forgive her, but I nodded in acknowledgement, realizing that some knots can never be undone. Eventually, we settled into a system of parallel parenting. There were no more lies or sabotage, just shared calendars and clipped texts about soccer practice. It wasn't perfect, but it provided us with some much-needed space. Last week, for the first time, Jake rode his bike to my apartment by himself. He skidded to a stop in the driveway, his helmet a bit crooked, and flashed a wide grin as he playfully challenged me to a race. I let him win, even though he never needed to know that I did. For a brief moment, I saw a glimpse of the kid he once was, the one who believed I could do anything. Maybe someday he'll trust me to hold that magic again. Until then, I'll be right there to meet him at the finish line.